I tend to think that those who discuss the subject of artisanal small-scale mining unduly oversimplify it. I think of artisanal small-scale mining as a composite of several issues. For one, the A speaks to a very genuine, historic way of making a living in many parts of the world. For the longest time in Latin American countries like Peru, countries like Bolivia, the ancient people of those countries were mining gold in ways that would today be described as artisanal small-scale mining. For that matter, if you come to Southern Africa, archaeologists record artisanal mining of gold in northern East Botswana and southeast Zimbabwe, and mining of iron ore in Zimbabwe and northern South Africa. And then if you go to West Africa, which is renowned for its production of gold, if you go to European museums, they are awash with gold pieces that were made by the people of those countries. So unless we recognize this history of artisanal smalls as genuine indigenous way of exploiting minerals, then we miss the point if we only see it in the context of contemporary history. The second thing that I think as to the complexity is the bundling up of this historic economic way of making a living with the S in the small scale, which is to say mining using mechanized methods, albeit on a small scale. Artisanal minings and small-scale mining are not one and the same. From a policy or a trade perspective, add to that the notion that in today's days, when we conjure up artisanal mining, we immediately think of illicit trade. Again, mutually exclusive, though there may be areas of overlap. I think delineating these various issues as separate component parts, applying appropriate regulation and laws to govern them, is a better way than to create one single composite issue, which in my mind does not represent reality. The outcome of a huge part of artisanal mining was a refined craftsmanship in the area of gold and in the area of iron ore, because these were the more commonly mined minerals. Hence, the pieces of art that we see in Europe and North America's museums, they represent this artistry. But the artistry was part of the artisanal mining value chain. So you extracted the ore, you melted the gold, and out of that you created pieces of art. And it was part of the trade. And that's why it's important that it not be simplified in the way that we find it. We have seen a proliferation of illicit trade. And sadly, artisanal miners are part of that illicit trade value chain. But to reduce it only to artisanal mining is really to misunderstand the issues. Lawlessness, poor border control, and for that matter, demand for this illicit good is as important an issue. I think it's worth taking a step back. The illicit nature of artisanal mining is in part founded in history, wherein when the Europeans came to Africa and Latin America and realized that the region was fairly wealthy in minerals, the administrative and the legal frameworks that were designed at the time, in my view, overlooked the need to create space for artisanal mining. In other words, whether intentionally or not, by blindly legislating for large-scale mechanized, inadvertently, the administrators of that time minimally rendered artisanal mining marginal, but at worst rendered it outright illegal. And I think the root cause in many ways of what we see now is that we've had this historic, legitimate vocation that, for all intents and purposes, was ignored. Well, it had to find an avenue. And some of that is that it has now gone underground and become illicit. So I think it's important that we reckon with this historic reality. Speaking of clean value chains, when the world looks at, say, gold, And there's an acknowledgement that gold that may be sourced through artisanal mining is in fact traded illicitly. That has the undesired consequence of effectively contaminating the gold market. The desire to clean the gold value chain derives from the knowledge that you can't ring-fence gold coming from large-scale miners against contamination by gold coming from illicit miners. And so the importance of cleaning the value chain en masse arises from this enlightened self-interest by those who trade in these high-value minerals. A large part of the remedy, as I see it, comes from several factors. First, to make sure that space is created for artisanal miners, both in terms of access to the minerals, but also in terms of how they trade. The second is that enough regard is given to those who mine in the artisanal mining space with respect to health and with respect to safety. The other important factor, of course, is that they must also make a meaningful contribution to the economy by paying taxes. There is no systems for taxing them and making sure that they too contribute proportionately to the national coffers. So I think recognizing this and addressing these issues is some of the ways in which artisanal mining can be regularized. In many countries where artisanal mining is fairly large, people recognize that there's a correlation between artisanal mining and poverty. Poverty, environmental degradation, exposure to environmental hazards, all of these are elements that make artisanal mining so problematic because all of them speak essentially to different legal instruments. They speak to a certain level of capacity and resourcefulness. They speak to a heightened level of political awareness and the desire to do the right thing. And unless we can put the cocktail of all these things together, my sense is that it'll be very hard for us to do anything with artisanal small-scale mining, and that it is almost impossible to address artisanal small-scale mining unless all of these elements are adequately addressed. And all these elements are costly, they're politically risky, and for that matter, they're economically self-destructive. Context is everything. But certainly in the context of what we are speaking about, what I would see as state abdication is where the state deliberately casts a blind eye and all the problems of artisanal mining that I have described because it is politically expedient to do so. That is abdicating. The very role of a government is to address these social and economic ills, and not to address them because it is politically beneficial to me is tantamount to abdication.